Hey everyone, welcome to the 36th episode of the Writ Podcast. There's been huge news in Ottawa this week as the Liberals and the New Democrats have come together for a confidence and supply agreement that, if it holds, could keep the Liberals in office until 2025. There's lots to unpack about what this will mean for the future of politics in Canada. So to join me again is the CBC's Aaron Wherry. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Eric.
So there's so much, and I don't really know where to start. But I guess it makes sense to start at the beginning about, we did hear some rumors, some chatter about it a few months after the election, and then we didn't hear anything. There was other things happening, of course. And then suddenly we just see the stories breaking on Monday night. So how did this all come together? And was this something that was just being worked on this entire time?
I don't know if it was worked on. I don't get the sense that it was worked on the entire time since the election. I think, usually when you see agreements like this, they come about because there's a real sudden need to do something, right? Like you're the second place party in the legislature, or you're a government with a tenuous grasp on power, and you need to do something to kind of shore up your stability in the legislature. And there really wasn't like a crisis or a real kind of urgent issue that made them have to negotiate a deal. So I think there were kind of talks in the fall, and then, there wasn't really a pressing need to do it, and there were other things going on. And so it kind of got shelved. And then, the new year starts and other things are going on. And I think that's when they start to kind of go, oh, you know what, it might be useful to have a deal here. Or are you still interested? Are you still interested? And that's when they kind of talk and it picks up pace. And the other element here is that they did it all very quietly, right? And they did it with a very small circle of people on each side. And I think that was primarily because they just didn't want stuff to leak. They wanted to be able to kind of do this in peace and quiet and figure out how to do a deal without it turning into a big media show. And so that's why it kind of seemed to come out of nowhere, because, everybody had heard these reports in the fall, and there was definitely, from the conversations I had, there was definitely some interest, but it wasn't really specific, and it wasn't clear that anybody was really rushing to do it. And then I think everybody kind of forgot about it. But I think, part of what gets you to this point is there's all these crises going on with the convoy in Ukraine. And I think there was suddenly a desire to kind of find some stability and find some security about how the next few years are going to play out. And I think that kind of helped push everybody together.
The stability question, I guess, is what really kind of drives this, because when you think about the recent confidence and supply agreements that we've seen, the one in Yukon, the one that was in BC in 2017, those were two parties that were smaller than the bigger party. The Yukon party, I think there was a tie between them or something. But in BC, it was the NDP was the second place party, the Greens were the third. In New Brunswick, you had the Liberals had fewer seats, but they were trying to hold on. So Blaine Higgs needed an agreement from the People's Alliance to kind of prove that they could form a government. But this is a case where it wasn't required, right? When you think about the past history of these kinds of agreements, it was usually a second and a third place party teaming up to beat the one that's in first. But it's a weird thing where the Liberals, it's almost like this wasn't a requirement. It's almost like a nice to have, not a need to have.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it, because I think that's what kept it, as I was saying, I think that's what kept it from happening quickly. But I think it's that stability that ultimately kicks in where, by the sounds of it, the government's looking around and they're saying, we just spent a couple of weeks dealing with the convoy. Now we've spent, several weeks dealing with the Ukraine crisis. We still have a platform to implement. Maybe we could do it by negotiating everything on a case-to-case basis, finding, moments when the NDP, the NDP would probably agree with all of these things on a case-by-case basis. But, if you're the government, you're thinking to yourself, I think, could we give ourselves some guaranteed time here where we don't have to worry about going to an election every 2 weeks, where, if crises pop up, we don't have to worry that, we're not getting platform stuff implemented, or we don't have to worry that this is this, that we're trying to kind of to deal with this urgent situation and also deal with the threat of an election. I think that stability is a real big selling point. And, I think it's also, it gets to a point where if we keep having, as I've written this week, like if we keep having minority parliaments, you need to find some stability at some point, because otherwise you're governing on 2-year intervals. And I just don't know that that's really going to work for anybody. And sort of the flip side of that is the price for the stability is the NDP wants to be able to say that they got a few things through, right? That they got dental care and pharmacare on the agenda when they wouldn't have been. And so, the government does have to put some water in its wine and make a deal here, but I think that stability is huge.
For the NDP, they do buy some stability for themselves because, they spent a lot of money in the last election and they only got one extra seat out of it. So they don't have really much of an incentive to go to the polls again. And they probably would have been the party that was forced into supporting the government in the next few budgets anyway. So I can see how this makes sense from their perspective to have something where they have a much more of a role in deciding these policies. They're not just constantly being pushed into a corner, but there is still that risk that at the end of it, people thank Justin Trudeau and the Liberals if Justin Trudeau's still the leader, and we'll talk about that later. But there is that possibility that if people like dental care and pharmacare and say, well, the Liberals gave us that, thanks NDP, but we'll just go for the Liberals. There is that risk there. But yeah. I suppose for the New Democrats, there was a risk with either option, right?
Yeah, and I think in the long run, they probably benefit from like an action instead of a deal by a moment by moment kind of crisis negotiation. It probably benefits the NDP to say, look, like we're not just the party that the government negotiated with on these things. We're the party that made a deal, that got these things in writing, that made this sort of long-term serious accord. And look at us, we have real influence over the agenda. But at the same time, I do think the NDP, and I think you're seeing them do it already, is they're going to have to make a concerted effort here to say, hey, we didn't just rubber stamp the government. We got things here. This is because this is because we're here that these things got done. And then you go into the next campaign saying, if you want more things like this, you need to elect more New Democrats, either because you want to put us in government or because you want us to have that continued influence in Parliament. And that's, I understand all of the kind of, junior, yeah, you're right. Junior partners in coalition governments traditionally, at least in Europe, they tend to suffer at the next election. I think the flip side of that is if you look at Jack Layton's time as NDP leader, he put a big emphasis on trying to capitalize on opportunities like this. And, I was rereading an article I co-wrote with someone in 2008 about the coalition when they put that together. And there was a note at the end of that story about how, well, maybe Jack Layton has just sort of has made himself look like kind of a lackey for the Liberals now. And of course, 3 years later, he was the official opposition. So I think there's something to be said for the argument that the NDP will be able to go to the public and say, look, we're not just a party of protest here. We're not just the party that, makes outrageous demands. We're a party that can do things. And, we should be taken seriously in that respect.
Also, just thinking about it now, a lot of the cases that we think of those junior partners in coalitions, you think of the NDP in Ontario in 85, 87, where the Liberals end up winning majority. You think of the Lib Dems in the UK, where they got kind of crushed after joining up with the Conservatives, or the Greens in the recent one in BC, where they didn't get anything from it. In all of those cases, those were governments that were still relatively young, right? Mm-hmm. When you think about it, in 2025, the Liberals will have been in for 10 years. And so there might not be a rush of credit going to the Liberals for getting this stuff in. There might be still this element of change, and maybe the NDP is not in a bad position at that point. If people say, that we're kind of done with the Liberals, the Conservatives might not be an option for some people. Maybe the NDP has suddenly made itself look like a government or potentially governable, party. So I guess it could work out in different ways.
Yeah, I think it's hard to predict exactly how this plays, because I do think the NDP has a pretty good chance of coming out of this and saying, look, we're not just the fourth party. We're not just, a party for sort of very distinct, kind of far left views or sort of niche demographics of voters. Like, we're a party that was sitting at the table with the government, and we're a party that, delivered sensible dental care policy. And so I understand the sort of knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, well, the NDP might get steamrolled here, but I just don't know that it's quite that simple.
Yeah, I guess I should bring up some counterexamples to my own counterexample. Trudeau in 68 and Trudeau again in 74, the NDP not getting a lot of benefit from having supported minority Liberal governments before that. So we'll see. History obviously doesn't always repeat itself. But what about the potential for other difficulties for the party? So there won't be unanimous support for this among New Democrats. There won't be unanimous support among Liberals. Centrist Liberals might not be very happy that the party is joining up with the NDP. More left-wing New Democrats might not be happy that they're joining up with the Liberals. In the longer run, does this have some potential for some problems for either party internally, not so much electorally, but internally?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, anytime you do something that hasn't really been done before, at least at the federal level, there's probably some risk, because you don't really know how the voting public's going to react to it and how they're going to view it. And I think you can see that kind of playing, that the fight to kind of frame this playing out in the House right now, because the Conservatives are all over this as a secret deal that has made the Liberals a socialist government, and this isn't what anyone voted for, and so on and so forth. And so I think there's it's a real contest to see how the public kind of interprets this kind of deal making. I do, the easiest impression to leave here is that the Liberals will have gone to the left by signing up, by making a deal with the NDP, and at least acquiescing to some of their demands. And so that's the frame that a lot of commentary will now look at Liberal budget decisions and Liberal policy decisions, right? We'll be looking for signs that the party's moved to the left, and it's spending like crazy, and it doesn't care about fiscal discipline anymore. And so I think that puts a real, that first of all, that raises a real risk for the Liberals, and I think it puts a big onus on Chrystia Freeland and others to sort of, if that is a problem, and we can debate whether or not blue Liberals really exist anymore and where the center is anymore, but the Liberals have to. I think the Liberals will probably want to show that they haven't sold out to socialism, and that they do have some fiscal discipline, and that just because they're relying on the NDP for support, they're still going to do other things, right? Like they're going to send lethal weapons to Ukraine. They're probably going to boost the military budget. They're not going to start, wildly taxing the rich. I suspect the Liberals will want to be sort of conscious of the frame that could be put on them, and if they're worried about either their own caucus members or certain voter groups, they're going to have to kind of show that, like, yeah, there still is a Liberal party here. It's not a Liberal New Democrat party.
And we should also not overemphasize the Liberals as a centrist party. If you do look at what their supporters want, they're much closer to New Democrats on all these sorts of issues. Often the NDP might be a further left their voters on certain issues, but the difference between the Liberals and the New Democrats is very small compared to the difference between Liberal voters and Conservative voters when it comes to a lot of these issues, right? You see it all the time on policy issues on the climate change, for example. Liberals and the New Democrats, usually their supporters are almost identical in terms of support. Things like whether you think Donald Trump is a nice guy, Liberals and New Democrats kind of see things the same way, Conservatives don't. So there's much bigger gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives. But I still kind of wonder what could happen with, because I think I saw Scott Bryson tweeting some things that he wasn't too happy about, right? Because he was an old PCer who crossed the floor to the Liberals. There does seem to be that opportunity, but I wonder if it is a very small group of people that is not a viable political party or anything like that. Which brings me to the Conservatives. But if you want to jump in on that, you can.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, there are very prominent politicians and commentators and liberals who you would describe as sort of blue business liberals, centrist liberals, Paul Martin liberals, but I confess I don't know where I don't know if that exists as a real huge voting demographic, outside of like business groups and such. I don't know how big of an actual voting bloc that is, and this may segue to what you're about to get into, but like, unless the Conservatives move to the center, I don't know where those voters are going to go exactly. Unless the Conservatives suddenly become the old progressive Conservative Party, the business liberals are still presumably going to have more in common with the Liberal Party than the Conservative Party. So I'm not quite sure how big the risk is.
Yeah, and it does depend who the next leader becomes of the Conservatives, because you can see a pretty compelling argument that could be made by someone like Jean Charest that the center is being evacuated, we should move there and we'll win elections. And that might actually be a very strong electoral pitch. I think it's the complete opposite of what the membership would want. The membership would not be saying, just because the Liberals are cozying up to the NDP means we should also go towards the left. I feel like the memberships, if anything, is going to get more hardened against a lot of the policies that the Liberals and the NDP are bringing in, which gives the advantage to someone like Pierre Poilievre. But now we're talking about a scenario where the Conservatives are not going to be united by the prospect of an election just over the horizon. They now have an election that's 3.5 years away. So I feel like there's much more potential now for the divisions within the party to have much more time to kind of crack and fissure and then finally split.
Yeah, I think that potential is there, and what always unites partisans, right, is the chances of winning and forming government. So I wonder whether Conservatives will hang together simply because they look at the polls and they look at the situation and think, well, the best chance of us forming government is staying together. So we'll see. I mean, if the polls crash for the Conservatives over the next couple of years, or if they lose another election, then maybe that's what drives them apart. It is there. You could see a world where if the Conservative Party goes to the right and the Liberal Party seems to be going to the left, where somebody gets the bright idea to try to form a party that's, center right, tries to kind of recreate the old PC party. I mean, it would be a huge gamble, and I don't know whether it would work. But you do wonder whether at some point the people who feel politically homeless, so to speak, suddenly decide they want to form a party of the middle. But I still think that self-interest of partisans may hold everybody in the same spot. And so I think it really depends on how the leadership race plays out over there, and how, it's so acrimonious right now that alone, regardless of the politics of it, the sort of attacks that are going back and forth, I would wonder whether that is as much a threat as any kind of philosophical differences, if that's as much a threat to the future of the party.
We haven't seen any moderate language, I'd say, from Charest or Brown on the deal between the Liberals and the New Democrats, questioning the democratic, legitimacy of it. So it doesn't seem like anybody is taking that space at the time, which, they do need to win this leadership race. They can maybe have even longer to pivot. Maybe that's something that can happen. Aaron O'Toole had to pivot within a few months, whereas the next leader could try to make a pivot in 3 years, but I'm not sure if it'll be as successful. But does this kind of deal, because now it is something that will have happened, and let's assume that it holds, or at least it holds for long enough. It will change conversations about elections in the future, right? Because after the 2008 attempt at a coalition, it was all about coalitions. But because the Bloc had been involved with it, it gave it a really dirty word. If this works out well enough, there might be a different conversation in future elections about whether parties can work together. And that seems like for the Conservatives, that could end up being, on the one hand, a good thing, you could say, if you're voting NDP, you're actually getting Liberal, or if you're voting Liberal, you're actually getting NDP. But it also means that after an election, the Conservatives might find themselves kind of lonely.
Yeah, it is. It does raise a bunch of so a couple of things. One is the next time there's a Liberal minority, the natural question will be, okay, well, are you guys going to work with the NDP? But the next time there's a Conservative minority, especially if the Liberal government is the incumbent at the time, like for instance, after the next election, the question for the Conservatives is whether or not they need a majority to ever really govern. Now, the math is complicated. There's 4 parties. To make it really work, you kind of need a pretty strong second place party and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily a slam dunk either way, but the Conservatives do have to start thinking, how would we govern if we somehow manage to hold power in a minority or gain power in a minority? How would we govern? Would we work with the other parties? Would we, try to pursue a case by case basis? How would the public feel about that? Would the public kind of wonder why we weren't working with other parties? The advantage the Liberals have is that there's kind of a natural partner. The Conservatives don't have a natural partner, either because, the parties are on the left, or because the other party, the Bloc, is a separatist party, and the Conservatives and everything else they've said about separatist socialist coalitions can't really be seen to be partnering with the Bloc. So yeah, the Conservatives get in a kind of a funny place here where they have to kind of think about, okay, well, what happens if we get a minority? How do we govern in that situation? And it's not clear to me that there's any thought being given to that right now. Right now, they just want to say what you guys are doing is illegitimate. And I don't know that they're really thinking long term about, okay, well, does that mean we can never make a deal with another party, or are they just assuming they'll never make a deal with another party? It does change the conversation about how Parliament works when there's not a majority in the House of Commons. And as I've written, and I probably said on here too, that conversation had to change at some point. When 5 of 7 elections have produced minorities, and you've had 7 elections in 17 years, something had to kind of give somewhere, where either people needed to go back to electing majorities, or minority governments and minority parliaments needed to figure out how to survive for longer than 2 years. And I don't know that the Conservatives have really found their place in that conversation at this point.
We're going to have an example of this unfolding in just a couple of months. We're already starting to see it in Ontario, where it seems to be commonly accepted that if Doug Ford doesn't get a majority government, that the Ontario Liberals and NDP will team up in some fashion in order to get them out of power. We'll see how that's actually going to unfold on the election campaign itself, kind of the rhetoric, and whether it's something that hurts the opposition parties or not. But we'll get an example of it. If Ford doesn't get a majority government, you can almost see how this has the potential to have a domino effect going forward. If you can imagine that this deal is struck, that the Ford PCs fall short of a majority, the Liberals in the Ontario then team up, it starts to become a transformative sort of thing that could have real repercussions for elections and politics in Canada for quite a while.
Yeah, totally. I mean, especially in the Ontario example, because that has been always the big question. Even before this deal, the question was how, if Doug Ford doesn't get a majority, shouldn't Del Duca and Horwath consider getting together and forming their own government? Isn't that just how math works? And now they will have, this example to point to. And I do think, look, if there's a legitimacy argument here somewhere. Let's be clear, accord governments, what the Liberals and the NDP are doing is perfectly constitutional, perfectly democratic. There's no argument there. Now, if Ford is 3 seats short of a majority, and there's a decent gap between him and the second place party, I wonder if cold feet sink in for the Liberals and the New Democrats. Do they start to worry that they're somehow not going to look legitimate, or that they're seizing power, or that it's too tenuous? That was part of the problem with the quote unquote coalition in 2008, was that it was pretty tenuous, right? The Liberals and the NDP together did not have a majority. The Bloc was supporting them, but it was, like the Conservatives had a pretty decent minority, like a decent plurality at that point in the House. So there was a bit of it was a little less clear cut, whereas when you look at situations like BC in 2017, the result between the NDP and the BC Liberals was very close. Ontario in 1985, again, the result was very close. I think the Liberals finished second in seats, but first in popular vote. So, I don't know. It will be interesting to see how it plays out, but I do think, so Doug Ford's going to campaign like Stephen Harper did in 2011, which is give me a majority, or the unholy alliance of socialists and liberals is going to take over. And for Harper, that worked. I don't know if it'll work for Ford, but the question Conservatives do have to at some point kind of reckon with is it majority or bust for us in all situations? In which case, are we setting ourselves up to really struggle in the years ahead? Or do we need to start thinking about how we would govern in minority situations? Is it sustainable for us to attack the legitimacy of these arrangements? Or do we have to start thinking about how we would govern in minority situations and how we would be able to hold on to power?
You're right, because the rhetoric does, in a way, have the potential to become something that is really problematic if you need a partner. And there is a willing one somewhere. If things realign somehow, it does seem to limit the options. There is also the possibility that this agreement between the Liberals and the NDP does not work well. It falls apart and it becomes cautionary tale. And I suppose that then sends us back to where we were before. So there is that also, that possibility that could end up playing out. So I want to talk about what this means for Justin Trudeau, because he is now, if this holds, again, this is a lot of this is predicated on the idea that this endures until 2025. He will have been prime minister for 10 years. He will have been leader of the Liberal Party for 12 years. I know that he has to say he's staying on, because otherwise that would be it. He'd be a lame duck from the moment he says he's thinking of stepping down. But does this almost inevitably increase the odds that he won't be the leader next time?
I think it at least makes it a lot easier for him to transition out of the leadership. You're right. I understand why people want to ask Justin Trudeau whether he's going to run in the next election, but there's really only one answer to that question until he's ready to actually say he's resigning. So I mean, he's not. We won't know he's resigning until he steps to the podium and announces it.
Or the night before, if based on
if there's Vashi will report it. If he does, look, it's pretty hard to keep running. With each successive election, it gets harder and harder to win, right? Because you got more baggage, people are getting more tired of you, and Justin Trudeau has been as public and prominent a prime minister as we've ever had. So it stands to reason that he will exhaust the public's patience sooner than most. It's hard to imagine like Justin Trudeau serving longer than Chrétien. I don't know. It's a very odd idea, I think, just because his hold after 2019 and after 2021 has seemed so precarious, I guess. But he could. I mean, I think a lot will be predicated on just the straight polls, how the Liberals are looking and how his own personal numbers are doing. But if he did want to get out before the next election, it was always going to be hard when there was no guarantee of when that election was going to be, right? Like, how do you announce your own resignation or announce your own intention to resign, allow for a leadership race, have that leadership race happen, and give your successor time to get into the job when you don't know when when the other opposition parties could fell you at a moment's notice, right? The ability to plan and be sure that you've got 6 months or a year to go through that whole process was pretty slim. So I think this does, if he's looking for an off ramp, he's got one now, right? If he was thinking that maybe he didn't want to run into the next election, he can now do that in 2023 or he can now decide to resign in 2023 or 2024 and give the next leader a good head start or a good chance to run in advance of the next campaign. I don't, I won't make any predictions, but like, there's lots of people that have underestimated Justin Trudeau at various points in his career. So who knows? He may want to run again. That would, if he ran again, I mean, depending on the math, he'd be in line to be the 5th longest serving prime minister, which would be pretty incredible at this point. But if he is looking for an off ramp, this deal really, really gives him that runway, to mix my metaphors.
It's hard to, I mean, because all we ever do really is assess the political gains, the electoral gains of all these kinds of decisions. And it might be easy to look at this and be like, well, it's all about staying in power. It's all about, for the NDP avoiding an election. It's all about this. Is it too cynical to or is it not cynical enough to look at this and be like, for the New Democrats, I saw Jagmeet Singh say, if we don't get the credit for this, as if we're at least giving people these things that they need, then that's all he cares about. There is an element that this could just be what these two guys would like to do and have decided to do it just to get this stuff done. But it's hard to separate the politics out of it because, I mean, they're politicians.
Right. There may be politics occurring here. Yeah, look, everything's political, but I suspect that there's a certain amount of truth and genuine belief in what Trudeau or what Singh said, and I suspect that reflects to a certain degree what Trudeau feels too. Is like, you're not here to just hold on to power and not do anything with it. You want to do something with it, even if you just want a legacy of your own. You at least want to be able to. You don't want to get out of office saying, "Well, he was there for a while. That was cool." You want to be able to say, "Oh, I did X, Y, and Z." And the policy implications of this deal, like they always get underplayed, but like this gives the current government time to really establish some of the existing policies they have going on particularly on climate and childcare, and it gives them a runway to implement all these new policies. The Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre is currently campaigning on abolishing the carbon tax. Well, based on the current situation, he's not going to be able to do that for another 3.5 years now. By 2025, it's going to be a completely different conversation because that policy will have been in place for that much longer. There's all sorts of things like that where there's big policy that's going to get implemented over the next few years. And if you're Trudeau or if you're Singh and you're thinking that, who knows what the political future is going to bring, you're at least going to come out of this with some policy on your record. And that, for the Liberals and the NDP, that's obviously going to give you something to run on in 2025. But just personally for those two, it also means when people go back in the history books, they'll say, oh, well, at least you got X, Y, and Z. Like people still talk about what Leighton got out of the Martin budget, right? So, yeah, there's politics involved, but at the end of the day, that the reason they're in power and the time they're in power gives them a chance to do all these things.
It's sort of, in a way, one of the following in the footsteps of what Stephen Harper did, right? Where it was the longer he's around, the harder it'll be to reverse some of these things. And that'll happen for the Liberals and the NDP just as much as it might have happened for the Conservatives while they were in office.
Yeah, and if you think about like Trudeau's time in office as sort of a response to Harper's, Harper wanted to kind of establish a conservative idea and a conservative party and sort of tilt the future direction of the government to the right. Trudeau has come in and tried to pull it back to the left. And if he ends up spending, as much or nearly as much or even more time as Harper in office, he'll have that much more time to pull things back in the other direction. And that's going to have lasting consequences. Like, the carbon tax is a perfect example. It'll be that much harder, however much Conservatives complain about it now, it'll be that much harder for them to switch gears 3 years from now.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to ask you for a prediction, but, what does your gut say? Do you think this lasts the whole 2025? That feels tough to me. I mean, the NDP out in BC, it was only a year until the next election. They decided to pull the plug and they weren't punished for it. And, you got to wonder if this kind of thing is built to last.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, I do think to connect the two questions, I think the policy and the promise of policy gives it a chance, gives an incentive for everybody to kind of stay on the same page. But yeah, I don't know that this gets all the way to the finish line. And you just never know how events are going to unfold. And, if the Liberals get rocked with a scandal and their popularity plummets, eventually Leighton decided to take out the Paul Martin government. Singh may have a formal deal, but if the Liberal government crashes for some reason or does something that he just can't deal with, there will be immense pressure on him to pull a plug. And for the Liberals, I mean, you would think that maybe they've learned their lesson about calling early elections, but the Liberals aren't always great at learning lessons. So, who knows if they're at 45% in the fall of 2024 for whatever reason, are they really going to go, well, we promised the NDP we'd stick around, or do they go, you know what, let's forget that we almost got ourselves defeated in 2021. Let's roll the dice again.
Yeah, let's not underestimate the potential for people to make bad decisions when it comes to politics. So, all right, well, there's going to be still lots to unpack about this for the next few years. So these are the early returns, and I appreciate you coming on, Aaron.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks again to Aaron Wherry for that discussion. If you like these podcast videos and the other videos on this channel, I hope you'll subscribe to it. I did post a few interesting videos over the last couple of weeks. I had one that's on Jason Kenney's leadership and another on Jean Charest in his quest to become the first former premier to be elected as prime minister. So you can check out those videos, like them, share them, and I'll see you next time.